Good morning, everyone. My name is Asha Vagware. I'm the student of MA European Studies at MAHE. I'd love to welcome you all to the second session for the day, which is titled as Always at Home, Never at Home, Journeys Through Bhutan, India, and Tibet. We have two guest speakers for the day, and we have a moderator, Mr. Chintan Girish Modi. I'll be introducing the guest speakers and the moderators for the session. Mr. Chintan Girish Modi describes himself as a traveler, writer, and peace educator. He holds an MPhil in English Language Education and the English and Foreign Languages University in Hyderabad. He's been writing on arts, culture, and gender since the last 15 years and he's also the founder of Friendships Across Borders, Aao Dosti Kare, an India-Pakistan peace initiative that focuses on storytelling, peace education, and creative use of social media to strengthen counter-narratives to hateful media propaganda. He has also curated Tana Bana, an online resource on India's diverse cultural traditions for Open Space India, and been an advocate for nuclear disarmament with Global Zero. At present, he consults with the Prajna Trust in Chennai on the Education for Peace initiative for work with teachers as potential peace builders, making a difference in the world beyond their immediate subject specialization. Now I'd like to introduce our guest speakers for the session. We have Mrs. Kunzang Choden, who is the first Bhutanese woman writer, a publisher of books for children, and is the curator of the Ogyen Choling Museum, Bhutan. Her first novel is The Circle of Karma, has been translated into several languages. Documenting Bhutanese folklore resulted in the compilation of folk tales of Bhutan and Bhutanese tales of the Yeti. Other books by her include Chilean Cheese, Food and Society in Bhutan, and Dawa, The Story of a Stray Dog in Bhutan. In recent years, she's also written books for children, Room in Your Heart, Auntie Mouse, and others in an effort to bring geographical and cultural context in the stories for the young Bhutanese readers. Now I would like to introduce you to our second guest speaker, Mr. Tenzin Tsundue. Tenzin Tsundue was born to a Tibetan refugee family in India. He's a Tibetan writer and activist. The author of 4 books of poetry and stories, he won the first ever Picador Outlook non-fiction contest in 2002. He's now working on his 5th book, a book of Tibetan refugee stories. Tsundue wears a red bandana as a symbol of his childhood pledge that he would work every single day until Tibet regains its independence. Some of his writings are being taught as a text in following universities: the University of Madras, Loyola College, Chennai, Emory University, Atlanta, United States, and University of Delhi. He has designed several creative writing workshops and has been invited as a guest speaker at many national and international literary festivals. I'd love to welcome the guest speakers and the moderator on the dais, please.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Manipal, MAHE, and MILAP for inviting all 3 of us here to have this conversation with you. Without spending much time talking about our individual biographies, I'll head straight into discussion because we have very little time together. So, this is a very special conversation, always at home, never at home. This is a theme that is not being discussed only in this particular panel, but has been there throughout the festival since the keynote that we had on the very first day. I hope over this time we've had a chance to reflect, confront, and even sharpen our understandings of what home means to various people. Instead of blabbering further and going into abstractions, I'd really like to locate ourselves in the experiences that Kunzang and Tsundue have had in their own lives in relation to their faith, to the community, family, and even citizenship. What does home mean to them is what we get to know in this conversation. So, Kunzang, what does it mean to live in the so-called happiest country in Asia or even the world? Like, do you not have any worries at all?
Yeah. I think it's mainly the work of the media that made us seem like that we live in the happiest country, because actually if you look at the happiness index, which is measured objectively, it's not Bhutan. I think it's Norway, in fact, and then some of the other European countries. But somehow we've been made to believe that we're the happiest country. But what the truth is that happiness is an objective that we are, that's also being used by the government. In fact, like the Planning Commission of India, we have a happiness commission. It used to be the Planning Commission. So now it's the Happiness Commission, and this commission has the mandate to see that every project, every government initiative, that the happiness of the people, the women, the children, everything is included. So it is being, happiness cannot be objectified. It cannot be really quantified, but there is a conscious effort by the government, by the people, to try and think of the happiness, because after all, happiness is what every human being desires. So when I go to places like this and people ask me, how does it feel, the question, I feel like everybody else. And happiness is so relative. I'm happier in the morning, I'm tired and not so happy. So it fluctuates. So I cannot say that I'm the happiest person from the happiest country, so-called happiest country in the world. Thank you.
Hello. I think they turn off the mic on their own from inside so that we don't have to bother. So how does the personal experience of home then change in relation to what the country itself likes to do as PR possibly? Because we have this Incredible India campaign, but living inside India, we know how not incredible it is in terms of violence against women, sexual minorities, and people from lower castes. So similarly, do you think there's a big gap between what the people at the top like to portray Bhutan as and what your experience as a citizen is?
Yeah. That's a question that is very relevant, because how this actually happened, I think some of you may be aware of it, is I think it was back in the 1970s when the king of Bhutan, he used to only go out for one international conference every year, and that was the non-aligned meetings. So once he came back, and I don't know whether it was in Mumbai or whether it was in Kolkata, he was surrounded by journalists asking him all sorts of questions. And one of the questions was, what is your GDP? Okay? And then he very spontaneously said, for a country like Bhutan, so small, with a very small population, with very small resources, we would rather count the GNH, gross national happiness, rather than GDP, because it makes no sense to us. And that rested, and that was, for a long time nobody talked about it. Then suddenly in the 80s and late 80s and the beginning of the 90s, this was somebody rediscovered this term, and they began to actually promote it. And the government also took it up very seriously, and we began to talk about happiness, and we also initiated a lot of international conferences on happiness, and then there were other agencies that came in, like the UN, said this is a great idea, and they also gave money to quantify it. Then it became more and more and more and more difficult and more complicated and abstract. And the Bhutanese actually said, you are taking happiness to all these international conferences and talking about it, and there is very little being done here for our own happiness. So when people began to get vocal. And now, our latest tourism, tourism is our biggest earner after hydropower, and they have even a logo for Bhutanese tourism which says, happiness is a place. So it's things like this that make us seem like we are selling happiness. But the people are now more conscious. They talk about it, happiness at home. And of course, it's always the people who come for 2-3 days are well looked after, wined and dined, and they go back and write about it and say, Bhutan is where happiness is, So it's a very difficult thing, and we have to deal with it, and we have to answer questions, tough questions like at these forums.
Thank you. So before I move to Tsundue, I want to ask Kunzangla one more question. We've been talking about happiness, but in a lot of literary and critical discussions, scholars and even like writers who take themselves very seriously as interpreters of the world would scoff at the idea of happiness because they tend to survive almost on thinking about literature as representing, the pathology of the mind rather than looking at happiness, which is somehow, sometimes treated as, being woolly-headed or in the domain of the spiritual, which people who identify as political want to distance themselves from because it seems such a right-wing thing to do. Unfortunately, these are the terms that get quickly labeled onto people instead of allowing for complexity.
Yeah, I think for us, happiness is not this, high, high, high. It's much more the contentment of the people. And this is what we want. And kind of a sustained contentment where, you are not in yearning or you're not in deprivation or you're not in, there is not a vacuum in your life. Somehow this is taken care of and people are, and this is possible in a small country like Bhutan where we have less than 1 million people and the welfare of the people is taken care of. But I attended the first international happiness conference in Amsterdam, and I had to write a paper, and they said you can write on any title, and I chose to write on women's perception of happiness, because happiness is not the same for everybody. Everybody has a different way of perceiving happiness. So this was not being looked at, and I was saying women have a set of criteria or conditions or frames for being happy. So I didn't do academic study research where I interviewed people on certain parameters or things like this. I just started preparing for my paper, writing my paper, talking to women randomly. And one of the things that stood out from these kind of unstructured interviews was a woman who said, Bhutan has come such a long way in the improvement of our life. There was a time when we had to travel we had to go for so many hours to get water, when we had to go and get the fuel for our thing, we had to buy, we couldn't buy the things that we needed, and there's so many tax, exemptions that you don't have to carry luggage, you don't have to give this much. And she said, I thought we couldn't be happier, okay? Then she said, I visited my children in the capital, which is Thimphu, and she said, they had so much more there than my village. And my expectations has gone up now. I want all these things before I can be happy. So the happiness level is all the time shifting and things like this. And Bhutanese are not different from anybody else. We want to have all the comforts, whatever is available that everybody else has. So this is the human nature. But as I said again, that because we are a small nation, we are kind of a welfare nation, everything is taken care of for us. So there isn't this yearning, I don't have this, we have free health, free education, free so many things that our basic welfare state is looked after. So it is a reality in many ways. Okay.
Thank you, Kunzangla. Now we move to Tsundue. Both of us have been speaking, in a sense, from a place of privilege, right? We have a country that we can call home. We're legal citizens. We live in the countries that we speak of, and we can speak critically. But for you, as you indicate in many of your poems, you you think of yourself as Tibetan, but you've not really grown up in Tibet. So what does the experience of home mean for someone like you who lives in India but longs for Tibet?
Well, home for me is not an abstract idea. It's a very concrete place, a country that is not free now. Tibet is under foreign occupation since 1949. And for us, that is the homeland. And that is where our home is. My parents came from Tibet, although I'm born in India. My parents came from there. And that exactly is the country which is our home. So home for me is not an abstract idea. It's not a, it's not a place you go to once in a while. It's a place where our Tibetans who are living there today are not living in freedom. And we are refugees living in India, hoping that one day we will be able to go back to our own country one day. So homeland, home for me is an exact idea of a country there. Now, having said that, there is also this idea of the culture where you are placed in. Buddhism teaches us that the home is on the inside. And today what we see is, although our country is not free, the way Kunzang was earlier talking about contentment. And as long as you train your mind to be contented with what you have, certain amount of happiness can be gained. And there comes in freedom. So, although our country is not free, we feel free.
What does this mean in political terms, in the sense of having a central Tibetan administration in Dharamshala and Tibetan refugees living all over the world, the uncertainty over, the leadership, because His Holiness the Dalai Lama is really old right now, and there is so much speculation about who would be the successor, so to speak. What are your thoughts on this, and what are the different imaginations of home that people have across Bhutan, Tibet, India, and other places where the diaspora lives?
Well, so at the moment we are looking at about 150,000 Tibetans who are living outside Tibet. Inside Tibet, where majority of the Tibetan population live, is 6 million Tibetans in Tibet under the Chinese occupation. And outside Tibet, in India, Nepal, Bhutan, and countries around the world in Europe and America, all put together is 150,000 Tibetans. And His Holiness the Dalai Lama and the Tibetan government in exile, they are based in Dharamshala, Himachal Pradesh, where I live, and I'm actually coming down from there. So Dharamshala is the kind of the unofficial capital of Tibetans in exile. His Holiness the Dalai Lama, right from the beginning of his exile life, from 1959 onwards in India, working with the government of India, he worked on two things. One is a democratic setup of the Tibetan community. So therefore, the Tibetan government in exile based in Dharamshala today is a democracy. We have 45 members of parliament. We have the president of Tibetan government in exile. Although officially we don't call it Tibetan government in exile, we call it Central Tibetan Administration. So it works with India's One China policy and China's One India policy. So therefore, it doesn't have to be protrudingly be difficult as Tibetan government in exile. We call it Central Tibetan Administration. We call it very mildly in that way. So first is the democracy, the idea of democracy. Second is the youth. His Holiness the Dalai Lama knew right from the beginning that this is going to be a long haul. It's not going to be an immediate diplomacy. And therefore, both Pandit Nehruji and His Holiness the Dalai Lama, right in the beginning, worked on children's education. So with the Government of India's sponsorship and support, they together created almost about 100 schools for younger generation Tibetans to, even though they are born in India, they grew up as a Tibetan, with Tibetan language, religion, culture, and sense of identity of being a Tibetan. That, I think, is also the idea of home. Where do you live? Which culture do you live in? What language do you speak? You know, in my family, I'm the first one with an MA degree in English literature, and that too now writing in English. But otherwise, I'm very comfortable speaking in Tibetan language, which is my mother tongue. So I live in my mother tongue. So all these actually build up the idea of home. You know, in what language do you live in what food or clothes do you live in. The another idea of home for me is also dharamshala. That's the place where many Tibetans live together in a kind of a big community, along with a number of Indians there. So it's only in Dharamshala where no one asks me, are you Chinky, Chinese, Ching Chong, Ping Pong, are you Kung Fu Karate, you know, all this stuff. Out of Dharamshala, when I go anywhere, you know, at some point of time during the day, koi na koi mere ko bolte tha, hey, Ching Chong, kya re? You know, it happens. It's a daily experience. And I have stopped fighting against this. So only in Dharamshala, it's a home where you are not interrogated of your small eyes and this, what we call the chinky face. In rest of the places, all these things come about. It's not a complaint, it's a fact and daily experience. Not just me, all across people from the Himalayas and Northeast. I think they... So anyway, what His Holiness the Dalai Lama worked on was, one, the Tibetan government in exile working on democracy, and two, the youngsters who are the future of Tibet. So therefore, today when His Holiness the Dalai Lama is 83 and China is calculating that after Dalai Lama, Tibet issue will die, but you know, this entire younger generation Tibetans are growing up. And Manipal alone has about 30 to 40 Tibetan students doing nursing and media studies and, you know, PhD, and some of the students are here. So this is the future for us. So with democracy and younger children, with a homed in Tibetan religion and culture, and with modern education, you know, Chinese calculation is going wrong. So I believe that India and Tibet together, we are working for a free Tibet, which will then solve India's problem of Chinese aggressions on the border, especially Doklam and all this.
Thank you. I was wondering if you'd be open to reading When It Rains in Dharamshala. It's a gorgeous poem. And it would also help us think of, you know, solidarities between various people under occupation, whether it's Tibetans, Palestinians, Kashmiris, and how that kind of experience can never quite be understood by people who don't have that experience. So, if you'd like.
Yeah. So I've been writing poetry compared to other writers. My writings are relatively recent because earlier, firstly, I didn't even have proper English language to write in. You know, I always wanted to write, but I didn't have that kind of command. I didn't have the imagination to write. It was only during my master's degree in Bombay University, then I started to write, and there were a number of other senior poets and writers I made friends with and started to write at that time. So I've written a number of poems, and this is one of my poems written in Dharamshala. It's called When It Rains in Dharamshala. Now this poem has also to do with a house I have taken on rent, and it is a story of that house when it rains in Dharamshala. And the house itself is an old British bungalow where I am living is the servants' quarter. And it's also about Dharamshala, which in Hindi, as we say, Dharamshala, but commercially it's written Dharamsala. And for us, Tibetan refugees, because we you know, hope to live there temporarily, for us it is not Dharamsala, it's is a dharamshala, because we hope to go back to our own country one day. So this is about that room I have rented in dharamshala where I live. It is also kind of a warning for other people who come to dharamshala on visits. I don't know how many of you have been to dharamshala. I know Chintan has. Yes, some more other hands. But if you are coming to dharamshala in future, come during the rainy season. It's not for the rains you're coming to dharamshala, because dharamshala is most beautiful during the rainy season. Why? It's not for the rains, it's in between the rains. In between the rains, when the rains have stopped, when the sky is clear and crystal blue, and from the height of McLeodganj, you could look down into the Kangra Valley. You can see details of the Kangra Valley. You could actually count some of those houses down in the valley and the rice field, and also bits of road in between from where HRTC Himachal state buses come in and then again, get lost into pinewood forest. And further down at the edge of the horizon, you could see Pong Lake, which is not visible otherwise because of the haze and all of that. During rainy season, you could see this. And this is only half the scenario. You need to look up against the Doladhara mountains. Right on top is the snow mountains, the snow peaks, and then the Rocky Mountains, then the pinewood forest. Then you also get to see the TV towers of McLeodganj and all this stuff. But another thing is, if you're ever coming to Dharamshala during the rainy season, don't come with cheap Chinese umbrellas. They go tatters. इतना बारिश पड़ता है वहाँ कि वो Chinese umbrellas वो फट जाता है. You need Jalandhar का छाता. You know the long one with a steel rod in the center, a big one. ऐसा. उसी से काम चलता है वहाँ धर्मशाला में. So this, because Dharamshala, it rains so much. What we say in English language, it rains cats and dogs. Dharamshala, it rains cats, dogs, and donkeys. Like so much of rain. So this is that poem. So it says, the poem is titled, When It Rains in Dharamshala. When it rains in Dharamshala, raindrops wear boxing gloves. Thousands of them come crashing down and beat my room. Under its tin roof, my room cries from inside and wets my bed, my papers. Sometimes the clever rain comes from behind my room. The treacherous walls lift their heels and allow a small flood into my room. I sit on my island nation bed and watch my country in flood. Notes on freedom, memoirs of my prison days, letters from college friends, crumbs of bread and Maggi noodles rise sprightly to the surface, like a sudden recovery of a forgotten memory. 3 months of torture. Monsoon in the needle-leaved pines. Himalaya, rinsed clean, glistens in the evening sun. Until the rain calms down and stops beating my room, I need to console my tin roof, who has been on duty from the British Raj. This room has sheltered many homeless people. Now captured by mongooses and mice, lizards and spiders, and partly rented by me. A rented room for a home is a humbling existence. My Kashmiri landlady at 80 cannot return home. We often compete for beauty, Kashmir or Tibet. Every evening I return to my rented room. But I'm not going to die this way. There has got to be some way out of here. I cannot cry like my room. I have cried enough in prisons and in small moments of despair. There has got to be some way out of here. I cannot cry. My room is wet enough. Yeah, so it's just reminding me of part of the question. I think I relate with anyone who is not at home. There are people who live in houses and still not feel at home. There are refugees who may be living in some other people's houses and still at home. So being at home is a state of mind. Not having your home may be a physical problem, maybe even political problem. So therefore, I relate with anyone who is struggling to have their own home, and many of them are political problems, some are social problems. So there may be freedom struggles, struggles for democracy, people in crisis, misery. I relate with all of them. But just as I was saying initially, for me, homeland is a country which is under foreign occupation today, and it is concretely there. But at the same time, I also think that not just because we are not in our own country doesn't mean that they can make us miserable. Whether I make myself miserable or suffering, it's completely up to me. No one can make me suffer. No one. If I'm angry, it is I who is making myself angry. No one can make me angry. No one can take my freedom. I should be able to be in control of myself. That is home. अगर आप घर में बैठे हैं, तो आपके मन की शांति यहाँ है. एक मकान में रहने से घर नहीं बनते. So that idea of home is very much on the inside. Are you able to maintain control and have that peace in yourself and not lose it, and do not then blame on someone else for their provocation or whatever negativity other people may be having it against you. So these are the spiritual strength that we have been nurtured on, and this, I think, is the key source of our culture. For me, I do not think of culture as physical emanations like the shirt I'm wearing or the mala that I'm wearing. These may be emanations of culture. The real culture is how do you respond to happiness and misery? The way you think, the way you keep in your mind, there lies the true strength. And I see someone who is born in India and lived here, I see the same strength in Indian brothers and sisters, everywhere. And this, for me, India is, for me, a home.
So far, we've been talking largely about home as defined by where you want to go or where you want to be, where you find comfort and community. But it might also be worth thinking about how for many people, home might be defined by what situation you want to leave, where you want to go away from. Because home and family are also the site of violence, whether it's people who are raped at home or women who are not allowed mobility because they are women, or queer people who are forced into marriages because that's the only way they can continue being loved or included. So I'd like to invite Kunzang to read this beautiful excerpt from her novel, which really deals with how home is defined by where we're allowed to go or not.
Thank you. So this is from my book, The Circle of Karma, and this is the home that is depicted where a mother and daughter are in conversation and talking very freely without the fear of anyone listening about themselves being women and in the house. Tsomo is in the house alone with mother. They are seldom on their own. This is a rare moment. They're in the kitchen arranging pots and pans on the shelves. The late afternoon wind hisses through the bare trees and beats against the bamboo mats, rattling them noisily under the roof. It's a warm wind, and Tsomo knows the spring will come soon. She has seen the buds on the willow trees ready to burst forth in blossom. It won't be long before the house fills. The adults will return from the fields tired and hungry. The children will come home exhausted and dirty. Mother looks out through the west window. The sun is about 2 arm spans away from the mountain top. She will start the fire for their evening meal as soon as the sun sets. There is a quiet, unhurried atmosphere as Mother continues to talk to Tsomo while she places the last utensils on the shelves. She always said that Tsomo was such a small and weak baby, she was surprised that she survived at all. Gesturing with her hands to indicate the size and tilting her head to the side to estimate the exact measure, she indicated, "You were this small, just a mass of wrinkles, and you could barely open your eyes. I was so afraid I would lose you." Tsomo is the 3rd child and the first daughter among the 12 children that Mother has born. Tsomo cannot imagine herself as a small baby, a mass of wrinkles. She was born in the year of the monkey. Tsomo loves hearing Mother talk about her as a baby. She finds it endearing and comforting. Monkey year is not considered a good year to be born in. So I was anxious and attentive when the horoscope was charted out by the astrologer. Your wheel of birthmark, which is called Ketakolo, is located on your knee. What does that mean? Tsomo asks, curious. That's exactly what I asked the astrologer. It means you'll be restless, always wanting to travel. That's what the astrologer explained to me. He was surprised that I had asked. He said everybody knew that. At that time, Mother thought, where can a girl travel to? Even a restless one. Not everything in the horoscope is true, necessarily true, but she kept her thoughts to herself and listened as the astrology went on to say that if the baby lived past her 3rd and 14th days, she would live to a ripe old age. Where is the furthest I can travel to, Mother? Tsomo asked her mother dreamily. Where? I don't know. Where can a mother travel to? Thank you. Okay, maybe I should go on a little bit. Her old thoughts were stirred by the childish question, then gently, teasing, perhaps you can travel as far north as Tibet and as far south as India. Mother laughs at the irony of this prediction. Where can girls travel to?
So this brings me to your own life story. What was it like for you as a Bhutanese girl to travel and come to Darjeeling, Kalimpong, and then eventually Delhi to study? What were your own responses to the kind of questions that we hear in Tsomo's voice?
Mm-hmm. Sitting with Tenzin, I feel it's almost trivial to talk about my having to live outside my country, because it was not by violence, it was not by political reasons that I was also in cultural exile for 14 years. Because it was in the 1960s, late 1950s and 1960s, early 1960s, the government of Bhutan had this education program which offered children to go and have an education, get an opportunity to have education, because until then we only had monastic religious education. So in the 1960s, the government said our children should be educated. They should have secular education. But where do we send them? Because there were no schools beyond the monastic schools. So I was among one of the children from my village who were sent out to study. And I was already 9 years old, and I had never traveled outside my own village. And of course, I was not sent immediately a lot of preparation of food and how we would travel and everything. But in the 1960s, early 1960s, there were not even roads. We didn't have car roads, so we had to walk. So it was a long way to the school. It was 12 days and nights on walking and traveling on foot till we reached the Indian border, and then we could travel. I was sent to a school in Kalimpong first, in Darjeeling first, with absolutely no preparation. Okay, so we were just thrust into these schools. I was sent to an Irish convent where they only spoke English. I had never heard a word of English. These nuns were very alien because I had never imagined they would be people with different eye color and things like this. But adding to that, they wore their nun's habits. So they looked like some kind of people, not really people kind of thing. And we were only allowed to speak English. The staff in the convent spoke Nepali. Once you left the school gates and went out, it was Bengali. And I spoke my own language, which nobody understood. Okay, so this was kind of this was the situation that I had to live in. Of course, over the years, I learned slowly the language, first Nepali, then I learned English. But this went on, and I call this 14 years as my cultural exile, because I was completely removed from Bhutan. I was even almost ashamed to say I was from Bhutan. Now I feel little pride in wearing my dress and things. So in those days, to be different, and children can be very observant and very cruel also. If you're different, they point out to you and they isolate you. Okay, yesterday we had the whole session on the othering, so I was always the other. Okay, so finally when I got to being used to this Irish convent and things, I graduated, and later on it was a natural choice to go and live in Delhi because I went to college there, and that's when I was talking Hindi and staying in quite a conservative college, Indraprastha, if some of you know where the Delhi University. So I also had this, and then I went back and be it fate or be it whatever, my circle of karma, whatever, I met my husband who's a Swiss, and again with him we traveled out. So all in all, 24 years of my life was not in my home. So I had this imagination of home. What you talked about, the concreting of your home is where your thing. But I had this very nostalgic, very yearning, idyllic kind of a home that after all these years, I went back to my home and I dragged my husband along and now I live there since our retirement, and I not only just live in the house, but I wanted to recreate and rebuild my house the way I remember it. And this resulted in this book, and I just want to read a small, just a paragraph from my preface, if you do. Is it okay? So this is what I've done, because for me, home was where I was born. And I was I could really relate to what Dr. Atam Singh Jeet on the first day said about people wanting to go home where their origins were. I feel very much like the salmon that he talked about after staying so much in the ocean outside where they were born. Going against the flow of the river, I'm going against the flow of time and going back to my home and trying to find the home that I was born in. And it's no longer there because, the home is there physically, but I am now recreating it and making it into a museum based on how I remember it. And that is really something that compels me and something that really was important for me. And as an older person, you want to retire and be in a place where there's medical facilities, where there are transport and travel facilities. But I'm going to my home, which is a village in central Bhutan, where there's just about 100 people in that village. There is no shops. Medical services are far away, and yet I've chosen to go there and be there. The place is called Ugin Choling. Ugin Choling is where I was born and where I grew up in. And now, as I get older, I find myself thinking of it more often as the place that I will one day go to retire and where I would like to die. Like the salmon, no? With no conscious effort, I can make the mental shift from having once lived in the house to guiding visitors through it as a museum. The emotional shift, however, is always more troublesome, even though the idea of turning my ancestral home into a museum is mostly mine. So I have, I knew how it was to swim against the tide of time, how I knew that the obstacles that I would face, but still it's a choice I made. And this is home for me.
So what were the ways in which you were trying to create a semblance of home when you were away? I remember you sharing with me and Tsundue earlier that you used to really look forward to food that was similar to back home whenever you could find it in Delhi. Can you share like what else you did to make yourself at home?
Briefly before we came in, we talked about where we had studied and where we had been, and I said I spent 3 years in Delhi, and I went to college, Indraprastha, and the nicest thing about being in Indraprastha was we were very close to Ladakh Vihara, where there was a temple, a Buddhist temple, and on the side there was a shop where you could buy momos. So every few days I used to run to Ladakh Vihara to go in the temple and eat some momos, and that was the connection between being somewhere else, but at least knowing where my spiritual longing and my taste was satiated.
This reminds me of Indians and Pakistanis who keep fighting in South Asia, but in New York City they would like try to find butter chicken and aloo paratha and suddenly find home when they have food that's shared. But going back to your own story and even the title Circle of Karma, in what way do you think your faith influences or impacts your writing? And this is something I would ask Tsundue as well. There's a shared experience of a community that's quite defined by a particular kind of Buddhism, Mahayana Buddhism. And how does that affect your own conception of yourself as a writer and the themes you write about? Because I remember meeting Tsundue in Dharamshala in 2013. One of the things that he said stayed with me. He said, our faith teaches us to remove all traces of ego, but the very act of writing and thinking of yourself as a writer makes you want to think of a certain identity. And there is how do you deal with that?
Yesterday again referring to the Northeast and what was the name? One of the panelists talked about how they were converted, especially in Naga and Mizoram, how they were converted to Christianity. And my own experience of having lived in a Catholic convent with nuns and Bible studies and things like this, it never took me away. It brought me closer, in fact, and I think for that I really applaud the nuns and the priests who were with there. They never really tried to change. So I remained a Buddhist throughout my Christian experience, and even today when I write, it's my Buddhist. I didn't have an upbringing as such because I came from a home where practices were done, the Buddhist practice was done, but I never really studied it. It was through by learning. And I referred a little bit to, in the Circle of Karma, how the moment you're born, I think it's within 3 days of you being born, you invite an astrologer and he makes out your whole life for you. He charts out your whole life and says you will live up to this year, this and this many years, and then you will do this, and if you do that, you'll become that. So the whole thing is laid out, and we're encouraged to read our horoscope once a year to familiarize yourself with what is laid out for you. Now, I wanted to write in my circle of karma that you don't have to follow and you don't have to be the victim of your faith or your what the astrological chart is, but it's important to make the decisions in your life that are life-changing and bear the consequences. And this is what I had, because she was told that she would be traveling because she would be restless, she will never get an opportunity to study because she's a woman and things like that. But she wanted to change that, and I felt, I think maybe it was my education outside, that I wanted to change what was written for me. But many people still in my country, they still believe that the fate is laid out for you and nothing can change. You can do some remedial prayers and pujas to change, but otherwise you will have to live. Like, I should have died a long time ago. I'm over 60, I should have died at 60, you know. So I think it's important to know that there is a life for you, but you're not a victim that you can change. Is that what you meant? Is it okay? All right.
Thank you. Do you want to respond to the same question?
Well, writing in Tibetan culture and writing in English are quite different, different ways of approach also. In the traditional Tibetan writing, because it's usually influenced by Buddhism, and that too from, of course, you know, we are talking about Buddhism from India. In Buddhist writing, it's the self-effacive humility where the idea of the self comes in. So the subject is more important than the writer or the writer's perspective. And therefore in traditional Tibetan Thangka painting, from scroll paintings of the Buddha and the Buddha's lives, or images of Tara Devi or anything, you will, however exquisite or how long it may take, sometimes some of the paintings, painters work on for 2 to 3 years continuously on one painting. And even then, you do not see a single signature of the artist on the painting. And that kind of self-effacive humility one respects, because these are works of art for a ritual. While in English language writing, the writer's assertiveness of one's individuality and one's own perspectives are there. And in following that tradition, in this small book of poems, I have my name here. You know, so these are two different ways of approach in writing. I think initially when the Tibetans first started to write in English, and it's been only 50 years when the Tibetans started to write. Before Tibetans coming into India, most of the Tibetans didn't know a word of English, and there were very few, countable number of Tibetans who could read and write English. And that too, those were the ones who were children of the aristocrats, or children who are somehow connected to their families in Kalimpong, Darjeeling, and Gangtok from Tibet. And those were the ones who were educated in English, and they could read and write English. But it was only Tibetans coming into India as refugees when they first started to write. And even today, Tibetans writing in English, it's even today countable few. But it immediately brought in a great sense of controversy in the Tibetan community, because the way individualism is asserted in your writing, and how almost considered disrespectful English can be, how personal it can be. For example, when you write His Holiness the Dalai Lama, in pronoun you would use he, H-E. And that considered hugely disrespectful to His Holiness. Some people even started to write he with capital H in between. So not to mean any disrespect to him. And some of the initial Tibetan writers in English, like Dawa Norbu, Jamyang Norbu, many of them were demonized in the Tibetan community. And one particular very famous Tibetan intellectual, historian and writer who taught in Jawaharlal University, JNU, for 20 years, he was demonized in the Tibetan community because he wrote in one of his articles, he said, our leadership is not dynamic enough. Now, what did it actually mean, leadership? Did he directly mean His Holiness the Dalai Lama? Or did he mean entire the cabinet ministers and members of parliament, all this stuff? But he was threatened and he had to run away. Mob of Tibetan in Dharamshala, they ran after him. And he had to hide himself in a tarpaulin on a HRTC bus from Dharamshala and went to Delhi and never came back. So this is what new language and new ways of expression creates that kind of non-conformity. And generally, Tibetan community is a very conform society. It's a very conformist society. Anyone who has a different idea, different ways of thinking are not usually appreciated and far from finding acceptance. So therefore, English writing became kind of a great aspiration for young Tibetans, young intellectuals to write, but they also feared going into that street. So therefore, writing in English has that, that desire to be the famous and to question, at the same time fear really taking up the pen. So writing in English and therefore the idea of home in terms of language, it also creates, are you a foreigner, are you inside, or are you outside? For example, my own writings, and there was one Tibetan literature conference in Dharamshala where all the organizers and most of the participants are the ones who are educated, studied Tibetan in Tibet and came to India. And they were organizing it. I was taking part in it. And they were saying Tibetans writing in English their writings are not Tibetan enough. So that would mean that my writing would be not Tibetan. So in that case, I'm actually more Indian than Tibetan, in the Tibetan community, in a Tibetan conference. So anyway, I want to read one poem here. I wrote in Bombay when I was a university student and didn't have a place to stay at that time. So by that time, I had made a number of friends among the writers' circle, among the arts circle. And I lived in Bombay for 5 years, and there was a point of time when I was looking for a place to stay, and I didn't have money to pay for room rents, but I kept on staying in different other places, from Nalasopara to Cuff Parade, all throughout on the western line. So once I wrote this poem from the experience of being in some of the rich houses in posh areas where we do afternoon high tea and readings and that kind of thing, where I've been to these big houses and I felt like saying, can I stay in your house? You have such a nice place, But I know that I cannot immediately ask something like that. And but then I thought, if I could feel this, there's no harm in making a proposal in the form of a poem. So I wrote this proposal as my proposal. I made 20 handwritten copies and gave it to 20 rich friends who have big houses on Cuff Parade, Bulabai Desa Road, Pedder Road, Warden Road, I gave them as my proposal. I'll tell you the results later. I'll read the proposal first. So the proposal says, pull your ceiling halfway down and you can create a mezzanine for me. Your walls open into cupboards. Is there an empty shelf for me? Let me grow in your garden with your roses and prickly pears. I'll sleep under your bed and watch TV in the mirror. Do you have an ear on your balcony? I am singing from your window. Open your door. Let me in. I am resting at your doorstep. Call me when you're awake. So I later asked some of my friends and said, did you consider my proposal? Look at the audacity of this poet. He was now saying, did you consider? Then they were saying, Tenzin, what proposal? I said, Are, that proposal I gave you in the form of a poem. Did you consider? Wistfully. They were saying, oh, I thought it was just a poem. That was her response. Another very short poem, again, on the idea of home. Here is a poem, it's called Exile House. And this is written about Tibetans living in India who the activists feel that they are now getting settled. अब ये लोग घर जाना भूल जाएगा. I feel that they are so settled that they may forget to go home, and would be such a tragedy. It would be shame, you know. We say we are refugees and we forget to go home. And many refugees have actually forgotten to go home. And one of them is my favorite community, Parsis. घर जाना भूल गया. So, you know, as a refugee, I take the right to, make fun of ourselves. And this is one poem I've written about that. There's one Tibetan word used here. It's called changma. Now, changma is a Tibetan word used for plants that are grown on the fences as part of fence around your house. Changma. Okay, so it's a very short poem I'll read. It's titled Exile House. It says, our tiled roof dripped, and the four walls threatened to fall apart. But we were to go home soon. We grew papayas in front of our house, chilies in the garden, and changmas for our fences. Then pumpkins rolled down the cowshed thatch. Calves trotted out of the manger. Grass on the roof. Beans sprouted and climbed down the vines. Money plants crept in through the window. Our house seems to have grown roots. The fences have grown into a jungle. Now, how can I tell my children where we came from? So the idea of complacency कि हम जा तो रहे हैं अपना घर लेकिन फिलहाल नहीं. So that complacency creeps into our life, then we seem to kind of getting settled. And then, activism, protests becomes a little difficult. So this is human life. And refugees around the world go through this cycle of protests, aspiration, and also the desire for life. थोड़ा मीठा, थोड़ा फूल लगाएं, थोड़ा परोस भी आ जाएं, that kind of thing. And in Dharamshala, it's very interesting how Tibetans and Indians live together, and they are each other's neighbors. Sometimes where I stay, for example, in Dharamshala, in that old British bungalow, my Indian friends who are originally from Patna or Trivandrum, who now got a job in Delhi, and they are on holiday, or they left the job and now have submitted their house, and they come to Dharamshala for their spiritual aspirations, and they come and stay with me. And so I become the host, and they become the refugee. And sometimes because on my speaking tours, I travel all across India. एक बार मैं बिहार पहुंचा, पटना शहर पहुंचा, and I was asking my friend, कहाँ हो? वो दिल्ली में है, किसी और के कमरे में रह रहे हैं, और उसका घर खाली पड़ा है पटना में. तो मैं बोल रहा कि यार आप अपने घर छोड़ के गए और वहाँ घर नहीं है. So my friend keeps on complaining about the room he had rented in Malviya Nagar. But he has left his home somewhere else. He is trying to make home somewhere else. So this idea of creating a new home in a new place is the trend around the world. So, in a way, everybody is in exile. And the tension between the urban and village, where village is the romance and urban is the trend, and people coming from to Dharamshala from Delhi and Baroda and everywhere, they come and say, Dharamshala has been spoiled. Because they all want Dharamshala to be small and cute and nice and romantic, and that they want all the Tibetan people of there to live in a very small budget and grow apples, you know. Like Dharamshala has also the aspiration to grow big and, you know, do some business and run your family. But they are hugely disappointed because they do not see now Dharamshala in that small and cute and minute. So the romance of the hills, of the urban areas, of people who have left their own homes in Gharwal or remote region in Palghat or in Kathiawar, somewhere. So they have left the homes, their new place. So this is a trend around the world.
Some of what you're saying is actually reminding me of Agha Shahid Ali's writing about Kashmir, where Kashmir has also been fetishized by Indians in a similar way, you know, like this haven almost to go to. Thinking about what you were saying, everyone in exile, it also reminds me of this Buddhist idea of seeking refuge in the Buddha, Dharma and Sangha. So on one level, we are talking about seeking refuge in a country, but I think there's that other element of refuge too that is pretty striking in your work as well as yours. Before we open the floor to audience questions, there are two quick things I want to ask both of you. So there is this perception, I think, in the media and generally among people that I hear in conversations as well, Buddhism as being a religion of peace and Islam as being the religion of violence. And I wonder why we need to create this sort of binary. One also finds that not enough, I mean, often so-called moderate Muslims are asked, you know, why are you not speaking out against violence? But I've never heard a Buddhist being asked, you know, why are you not speaking out against what's happening in Sri Lanka and Burma, and why this kind of differential treatment of both faiths? That's one question. And the other is, how do you respond to feeling at home or not at home in the publishing industry itself, which has become so glitzy and glamorous now? You know, you chose to publish with a feminist publishing house, Zuban, and you've chosen to self-publish for the longest time. So these two questions, if both of you could respond to.
I think I'll leave your first questions for Tsundue, and I'll just talk about publishing. I always said that I was very fortunate to find a publisher in India, and that happened in a very unexpected way. I was at a conference like this, organized by the SARC Writers Conference, and I read my paper there, and it just happened that Urvashi, who is the CEO of the Zuban, she wanted to talk to me, and then I told her, I actually have a manuscript. And she said, what is it about? I said, about women in Bhutan. And she said, let me have a look at it. And that's how it happened. So I was really, really lucky. I didn't have to go knocking at all the publishing houses before I got a home for my book. But the my first two books, actually 3 of my books were published in Thailand, because at that time I was living in Laos. So it was the obvious place to be. But over the years, as we started publishing, as I started writing a little bit more, publishing became very difficult. And particularly for this book, I went to all the publishing houses who I thought would have a home for me, home again. And you know, everybody said now in the digital age and book publishing is difficult and we will not invest, but if you give us the money for it, if you finance it, we'll publish it for you. And then I thought about it and talked with my family. If you're going to give the book to somebody, give the money to somebody else, might as well try and do publishing in by our own self. So this was the first book that we published after creating a publishing house. Of course, having your own publishing house, it's a lot of headache, and actually writers getting involved with the nitty-gritties of publishing and the finances and the rights and all, it's not recommended, but in a way you have control over your book. So this is my publishing house, and now my son is in Europe and he's actually trying to make a branch of this on Amazon. So it just keeps growing and you have to grow with it. And in Bhutan, most of the people self-publish because it's so difficult to publish outside. And we are competing in our quality and readership with none other than India, where you have millions of writers waiting to be published, and our manuscripts, I guess, somehow get lost in between the huge piles. So it's a bit of luck and bit of ingenuity, how you go about how to do. That's how it is. And then you were asking how you get our ISBN. We also have an agency now, since of late, since people are publishing more, we have an agency for getting our ISBN.
Thank you. I think it's a very important question in terms of religion and stereotyping certain religion or culture for being violent or non-violent, or even romanticized for being non-violent and peaceful. I think it's completely individual responsibility. No religion or culture by nature are for violence or any way. I believe that all religion teach, encourage, inspire people to be good human being, to be happy on the inside, and to be able to help others and create that sense of peace. I believe that all religions do that. Unfortunately, certain groups of people in certain religions have perpetrated that kind of violence, and therefore it's been stereotyped on other religions also. But at the same time, that control mechanism, like you are Buddhist, why don't you control others? You are Muslim, why don't you control others? It just doesn't work, because you don't have a control over other people's faith or other people's ways of working. For example, Muslims in India, how do they control, for example, Muslims in other countries? Or Buddhists, for example, very often His Holiness the Dalai Lama had been asked again and again, why don't you control the Buddhists in Myanmar for the Rohingya Muslims, all the trouble that started there. But look at this, in reality, His Holiness the Dalai Lama, he's been traveling all around the world, except for Buddhist countries. If you actually notice, His Holiness the Dalai Lama cannot go to Buddhist countries. He cannot go to Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam, Thailand, Sri Lanka, Burma, not even Bhutan and Nepal. He cannot go because these countries are hugely under Chinese influences. See, so if His Holiness cannot go to those countries, how can he influence those? So it is more politics and divisive manner than of any control over or even have leverage on that. And therefore, I personally believe that peace is purely individual responsibility. You have to create your own peace, and at the same time, you cannot blame others on violence. That. And also, as an activist, I've been in the Tibetan freedom movement as an activist for the past now 25 years. I'm now 45. I've been to so many jails. I've been to 15 different jails, and that's my personal record. I've been to jails in Tibet under Chinese occupation. I've been to Tihar jail and jail in Ahmedabad and Goa and Bangalore and Delhi and Uttarakhand and various other places. So as an activist and also as a writer, I've been in both these places. Now about publishing. I think I was very fortunate that I was in Bombay at the time when some of the best Indian writers in English, they were alive at that time. I was able to meet and make friends with Nissim Ezekiel, for example. He was there at part of the poetry circle meetings. Every second and fourth Saturdays they used to meet. So Nissim Ezekiel, Ranjit Hoskote, who was here yesterday, he was also there at that time. So Ranjit Hoskote, Jerry Pinto, Arundhati Subramaniam, T.R. Joy, Prabhanjan Mishra, all of them were there. And there was a time when Dilip Chitre used to come from Pune, Arun Kolarkar, who used to be are always around, Kiran Nagarkar. These people are always around. And I was friends with Dom Moraes. I used to go to his house on the Bandu Reclamation house. And I used to show some of my poems and writings there. So I was really fortunate that I was there at the time when these people, stalwarts of new writings, they were there, and I was able to show my writings and also hear and take part in their discussions. Sometimes in Kalagora area, at the Wayside Inn, which is now shut down later, there used to be readings by Gulzar Sahab, Arun Kulatkar, and Dom Moraes together on one bench. And there used to be only about 20 people listening to them. So I was really fortunate that so I started writing at that time. Now, it was also the time when I had started to write, and my first book of poems called Crossing the Border, it came about just after my first MA. And I learned it from the hard way. I didn't have a publisher, so I borrowed money from my classmates, like 200 rupees, 300, 500 rupees. I made 22,000 rupees, and with that, I published my first book of poems called Crossing the Border. I got it printed and sold it, and for younger students, aspiring writers, I got myself invited as a writer to some of these 25 colleges in Bombay and spoke about writing, my experience of writing, and sold copies, 40 rupees a copy. And after selling 1,000 copies, I not only paid back my friends, with that I did an extra MA. I did MA in philosophy after my MA in literature, Bombay University. So I learned how to, how to really do the economics of publishing and self-publishing and selling it on your own. Ever since then, I wrote 3 other books, and all of them are books of poems. And this book, Kora, books of poems and stories, first published in 2002. And since then, this is my 12th edition. So far, I sold 30,000 copies. And so for a book of poems to be selling 30,000 copies is a big achievement. And more than 30,000 copies selling, I've personally been living on the sales of this book for 15 years. I'm able to do this because the income is small, but my expenses are smaller. The mechanism is, I get this printed for 9 rupees a copy in Dharamshala. I sell it for 50 rupees. And this is, high fashion, what we call eco-friendly, recycled paper. Is actually this. The cover is a recycled handmade paper. It's a double color screen printing with 2 stitches of thread in the middle. And inside, I'm using newsprint. This is the paper people use for newsprinting, in Times of India, all of that. This is the cheapest paper in India. I'm using newsprint and still looking sexy. And why I'm talking about this, because I'm trying to sell copies to you. And this is how I do. I travel all across India. I carry with me 100, 200 copies of my book, because if 50 rupees, anybody will buy, right? And I sell copies with this, and this is how I earn my living. This is my only source of income, and I'm able to do that. How? Because I live in 2 pieces of clothes. I have a shirt like this, black Tibetan shirt, and jeans. And people always see me in 1 piece of clothes. But they do not know I have 2. I have 2 shirts, I have 2 jeans, I wear them in turns. The other pair is in Dharamshala waiting for me. When I go back, I'll wash this and wear the other one. And still you get to see only in one, see me only in 1 piece. And that's how I manage. I bring down my expenses right down to minimum. And this also, a survival tactic. I think it is important today when we talk about environment and consumerism to practice, not just talk, practice. I've minimized completely to this. And also, luckily, I don't have the aspiration for wealth and power and position and all of that. Luckily, I don't have that. And by strategy, I did not marry. So I don't have to take care of, family and, bacha and all of that. So I'm completely in the work of the Tibetan freedom struggle and also working as a writer. And I've been writing small books of poems, completely living out of this, and therefore find my own idea of freedom. That it is not just an aspiration, but practically doable one.
Thank you. We're going to open the floor to audience questions, but before that, I want to thank MAHE and MILAP for bringing us together. And India tends to be big brother in South Asian conversations always. I'm really glad that we had so much time to listen to a strong Bhutanese voice and a strong Tibetan voice. It's really my good fortune that the circle of karma brought us to this moment where I could do a panel with the two of you.
Yeah, and also because being a Tibetan, it is only in India where I'm able to speak openly like this. Nepal, I wouldn't be allowed. Bhutan also difficult because there are so much pressure from China. So I can never participate in a literature festival in Bhutan or in Nepal. While this is a place where we can actually come together on one dais and be together and say, oh, okay, we found each other. So I really want to thank the whole entire institution and also the festival for bringing us together here.
Thank you to Anusha in particular who coordinated all of this. And we have time for questions. Is there someone with the mic? Okay.
I won't take long. It's a very exciting moment for me. It was very nice to listen to you, madam. I was born in free India and I was always at home. But it's very exciting and I have to say it here. I was born in Dehradun. And can you answer my question? Who's the personal physician to Dalai Lama, if you know him?
Well, there are a number of them.
Okay, so do you know Setan Dorji?
Yes.
That's all I want to do.
Okay.
Please tell Setan Dorji, he was my MBBS classmate in Pondicherry. He was my best friend, and this is the most exciting moment for me, and I wanted to share it with everybody.
Yes.
And you have to take a photograph with me later to show
Yes.
Setan Dorji.
We will do. Dr. Setan Dorji. As we say, Dr. Setan Dorjila, he is the head of the Tibetan hospital called Delek Hospital in Dharamshala, and he does all the physical work for His Holiness. And when he travels around India, he has to travel with him.
I have a question now.
Hello. Yeah. I'm a student here, and I'm a volunteer. Normally, I'm not supposed to ask a question, but you mentioned Parsis, and I think that is one spirit to live together, because the original story must be knowing how Parsis came and how the cup was offered and like mixed sugar, in the, yeah. I think I will comment.
Rahul, you want to ask something, right? You can ask during lunch.
So my question is to Tsundue. Is being minimalistic an outcome of being a refugee?
Not necessarily. There are some of my Tibetan friends who cannot live with 17 pairs of shoes. So it's completely up to them. I don't know, somehow from childhood, I think I'm being nurtured with the idea of these legendary sayings like simple living, high thinking, that kind of thing. It's a huge influence on me, and also my study of Buddhism. For me, Buddhism is not rituals. It's true practice of what Buddha said and how we manage our own patience, love, and compassion. And there too, selflessness. Yeah. So these are my practices of Buddhism.
One more question.
Wait. Can we give an opportunity to someone else, because it would be unfair to give you...
Yeah, sure.
Thank you for this very beautiful session. I think this has by far been one of the most enjoyable sessions that I have attended. A question to Tenzin. I'm glad that you alluded to this aspect of the Tibetan community to a certain extent getting nativized here in India. Well, one could be, let's say, the larger Indian culture which surrounds it, sometimes even dwarfs it, so to say. How do you as a writer anticipate further shifts in this kind of identity dilemmas? And as an activist as well, what is the roadmap that you have? Because not only that, I don't know, maybe perhaps it has already started. You could perhaps have inter-community marriages, as a result of which the notion of home keeps shifting further and further. And you have always this prospect of hyphenated identities. You become a Tibetan Indian, or things of that sort. So your views on that?
Yeah, recently we had a meeting in Dharamshala. So we had two interesting friends sitting together. One, a Delhi girl married to a Tibetan boy, and just next to her is a Malayali man married to a Tibetan girl. So this is already happening. Yeah. Earlier, I think there was a point of time in the 1980s, the community feared of integrating and feared of mixing and therefore dilution of culture. Now I think the confidence is much more that we have been successfully able to maintain our Tibetan religion, culture, at the same time receive modern education and be as Indian or as international we can be, because almost about 40 to 50,000 Tibetans are living outside India. And if they can be as Tibetan or as American or European they can be, why not the confidence in India? So that mixed marriages is happening, but that fear, I think, has come down, and therefore confidence level has come up, and integration. And also, over some time, we have also come to understand that what we call Tibetan culture is actually Indian. 99% of Tibetans are Buddhist. And if Buddhist is not Indian, then what is Indian? Right? So His Holiness the Dalai Lama always says, this muscle, however flaccid it may be, this muscle is dal roti. His Holiness always says this. And this brain inside is Indian mind. She says, the body, the face, as I have written in one of my poems, I said, I'm more of an Indian, except for my chinky Tibetan face. So this is one of my lines from my poetry. But His Holiness says, it is the mind that matters, and our mind is Indian. And in fact, Tibet and the Tibetan people, including Bhutan and people all across the Himalayas, we have preserved our religion that is born in India in the purest form. And today, with His Holiness's effort, we are able to return it back to India. The entire literature that was burned in Nalanda University were already translated into Tibetan language. And now, they are being translated back into Hindi, Sanskrit, Pali, Brahmi, and English at a university called Central Institute of Higher Tibetan Studies in Sarnath, Varanasi. And it's Government of India's project. So Tibetan community is bringing back the literature India lost in Nalanda University. So this is, now when we actually look at this, then you actually do not know who is Tibetan, who is Indian, right? So I think that idea is coming about. And one small thing. I think as a refugee, the mentality of a refugee is that we have to survive. And because we have to survive, we cannot be orthodoxical. We have to learn new languages, new cultures. We need to integrate. We need to make friends. I think Tibetans in India speak more Indian languages than Indians themselves. இங்கே யார் தமிழ் பேசுகிறீங்களா? முன்னு தருதுண்ணே சரி சி அந்த நானும் தமிழ் தெரியும் மட்ராஸில் 3 காலேஜ் படிச்சிருச்சேன் நுங்கம்பாக்கம் லாயலா காலேஜ். So this is the level of Tamil I speak. So how comfortable, how homely I am in Tamil language is same level how many of my Tibetan friends who are sitting in the back, they can speak Kannada in that way. They can give a lecture in Kannada. So this is the level of, firstly, it's survival, but also learning. And as you learn, you know, learning of any language or culture or food, it enriches you. It doesn't make you any less. It makes you bigger and better. And this is how we survived. So I think it's a true celebration of learning different languages and cultures. And this actually is the idea of freedom as we fight for.
We're getting multiple indications that we have to stop and head for lunch. But thank you for all your warmth and all your listening. I think we could feel it right here from there. His books are on sale, so please come by, get them signed.
Yeah, business. So 50 rupees a copy. I have a lot of them with me, entire bag full of it. So come and buy copies, and only for 50 rupees. And it makes very good gifts to your boyfriends and girlfriends. Your teachers would love it if you give them a copy like this. Also, from Dharamshala, Anyway, thank you.
Thank you so much for your lively stories and poems and for an amazing session. Because of time constraints, we have to conclude this session, but by the only Hindi literary club of MAHE, Gunj, we have a poem recitation session for half an hour, and then we would have a lunch break. So I request all of you to please be seated. Thank you so much.